Chapter 12. After High School Part 5, Fall Term 2015 and Spring Term 2016. The fall of 2015. During September, I decided to add my mom's on Facebook. She had impressed me a lot since the previous fall, but I was mad slow reacting to it. During last December, she told me she had read the Quran. Later the same winter she tipped me about a nose cleaner, which I replaced the nose spray with, and then in August she told me how to really use colloidal silver, which was necessary for me to get healthy again after having been stuck at home with a severe cold for about a month. I ordered the colloidal silver over the internet in October 2014 due to the Ebola scare, and I took a glass of water every morning with 5 milliliters silver when I was sick. But then after about 3 weeks, Moms told me to take 50 milliliters with 100 milliliters water, a third of the whole glass. Then I got healthy in less than a week. She also told me one time this fall that I was better developed than my old classmates, that I was obviously harder to deal with due to my ADHD features and my constant discontent, but also that that was the reason I made it through high school and then living on my own so good. I'd always experienced my parents as being so ungrateful for my normality, but now Moms really started to understand stuff. Alhamdulillah, all praise is due to God. One thing I hate about ASP is that it clearly hurts one's relationship with one's parents, no matter how good they actually try to raise their kid. Just being white middle class has never made them any lesser parents. Midgård certainly taught me that. Hip-hop didn't help me too much when it came to my relationship with my parents. It seemed to only distance me even more from them, and that probably would have been the case even had I been normal from the start. But in the end, it only brought me closer to them, especially now when I became a Muslim. Alhamdulillah. During the same month, I wrote on Facebook a long post about my last year's experience with this woman I'd met, and how it brought me to Islam. I'd also recorded numerous songs. I remember the fall of 2009, when I started my second lyric blog, where I rewrote Tupac songs from his first 5 albums and then 50 Cent. Now I got to do pretty much the same, but now I also got to record everything and publish it, completely without my parents' acknowledgement. Even though I can't stand by exactly all the lyrics nowadays, I have to be proud that I got to re-experience high school like that. I'd been praying 5 times a day since Ramadan started, but it wasn't around September or October that I started praying regular times. At first it was too hard since the timetable changes so drastically. But then I came up with the idea to stick to pretty much the same times all year around, meaning the times that apply for about March and September. Then I tried to study how to pray each prayer. Until now I had been praying all the prayers like the Fajr prayer, meaning 2 loud units, rakat in Arabic. Now I accepted the 2-4-4-3-4 model like I've described it here: Fajr, 2 loud; Dhuhr, 4 silent; Asr, 4 silent; Maghrib, 2 loud, 1 silent; Isha, 2 loud, 2 silent. The winter of 2016. A deep dive into Islam. During January, I started doing a deeper research into Islam. It started with me having some personal opinions and questions, but then I wanted to take a deeper look into everything first. I looked up music prohibition, dress codes for women, how to use the bathroom, etc. The information I found looked real truthful actually, and it scared me a whole lot. I got totally paranoid and took everything way too serious. It made me want to drop out of Islam altogether. The beef at Earsbuda and an ongoing sugar addiction definitely played a huge role in all of this also, for better and worse. My sugar addiction started on December 26, 2014 already, Boxing Day, 2 days after Christmas Eve, and would go on until April 30, 2017. At Earsbuda, I never found the guy nor came to any whooping, and I'm only glad I didn't. It could have led to anything, and things got bad enough already without a fight. But at the same time, I knew something was wrong here. Many sites had only newly written information completely without sources, but others did have verses with sources, and when I looked them up, I found out that they were written 200 plus years after the death of Muhammad, God's peace and blessings be upon him. Such verse is called Hadith. I googled up Quran versus Hadith, and then I found 2 sites that explained it real good. I don't want to link to those sites, and I'll explain that right now. These hadiths were written by different people 200 plus years after the death of Muhammad, peace be upon him, and they don't come from the Quran itself. According to these sites, these hadiths were written to manipulate Islam by adding a bunch of unnecessary, weird prohibitions like music prohibition, Men and women can't shake hands, you have to use the bathroom in a certain way, etc. This conclusion was real hasty. It was just that I felt such a relief after having gotten it, quote, confirmed, that these hadiths are false. Consequently, I started taking the Quran a whole lot more seriously. I could surely promise now that I would never leave Islam entirely. But even here, I knew I had to be careful. I knew I had to know how to differ between the Quran verses in question and different people's descriptions and interpretations of them. These sites were also not to be taken too literally, neither I understood. Different people can have different descriptions and translations of the same verses. Several verses can be taken from different chapters and be bent towards a certain direction or contradict each other. Most of what I found made sense to me, but one thing that really turned me off all of the sudden was that on the first site, it said you're supposed to pray only 3 times a day, Fajr, Dhuhr and Isha, 1 rakat at a time. On the other site and some other Quran-based sites I found, it said you're supposed to pray 5 times a day and totally 17 rakat, like I had been doing this far. Of course I stuck with that, and perhaps rightfully so, as opposed to something else. I was very keen on not prohibiting things unnecessarily, so I didn't want to make one mistake or the other here. That's why I went so hard on this information, since it invalidated all of these hadiths, a lot of which are obviously false. A lot of it had to do with me wanting to do a better job living up to my title as a Muslim by not being too strict nor too sloppy. I was well aware of the heavy responsibility I had now as a convert. I also became deeply afraid of an eternal hell, Jahannam, after death, but I also became no less afraid of throwing away so much of this life unnecessarily, knowing that that could just as well lead to Jahannam actually. Indeed, throwing away this life which has been created by God out of all things will surely lead to Jahannam in and of itself. It's a very cynical and selfish attitude to just wait for death to take one to a better place, forgetting that it was God out of all things who created this planet floating in space. This in turn would turn out to be all the more true the coming years. Nothing turned me upside down like this since I made the ultimate decision in November 2014. I'd learned a whole lot of valuable lessons and had realized even more how sloppy, worldly and lost I'd been the whole year. I'd taken information a little too easily from all kinds of sources, but I'd also realized that a lot of homies and rappers, Muslims and non-Muslims alike, had had some pro-Islamic opinions about some things they had pointed out, which I at first didn't agree with, so I was glad to not have to go against the grain entirely for that reason. I went straight into Alex Jones without a doubt, understandably so in the beginning, but it went a little too far in the long run, even in the beginning. I wasn't gonna make the same mistake again, with anyone or anything. Science and religion often go hand in hand, but sometimes there are conflicts and then you might have to choose, or better yet find some kind of balance, if yet hypocritical and self-contradictive. A lot about Islam is evidently very misleading if taken too literally without regard to worldly consequences. That explains why Alex Jones got such a grip on me in 2010. The thing about him was just that he didn't focus too much on Christianity and the Bible. That would have never worked on me. He focused on science and physical evidence. He talked about God in such a way that people of all religions could relate. I've always had a tendency to judge a religion by its people. One time, a Muslim at the Deen show said you can't judge a car by its driver and that you have to read the manual, and for the same reason that you can't judge Islam by its people and that you have to read the Quran. The way I see it, it's obviously much easier to read or watch reviews in the news or on TV about the car rather than just reading the manual. But the best thing to do is obviously to drive the car yourself. For the same reason, the best way to learn about Islam is obviously to convert yourself and then practice it for a while. But when I read the Quran during January and February 2014 and I got hardly anything out of it information-wise. I've always learned much more about Islam through other ways. Reading the Quran didn't prevent me neither from doing some haram stuff I did later that year, but that obviously ain't the Quran's fault. The autobiography of Malcolm X, which I had read twice as of then, last time during the summer of 2013, couldn't prevent it neither. But then again, no book alone can explain everything. Some things you gotta go figure out yourself. Prodigy's My Infamous Life, which I read in February 2012, didn't make me change my diet, even though he described in detail how he did it. That's something I did myself much later that year. All of this only confirms how badly retarded I was in the past. Nowadays I surely know better. It was just that now suddenly I had a lot to sort out about Islam. But during the same period, I found out something miraculous, and this alone should make anybody convert. I googled up how the Quran was written exactly, if it really was written by God. Then I found a whole lot of verses that couldn't have possibly been written by any human being anywhere on this whole planet 1400 years ago. Things that non-Muslim researchers and scientists have discovered only during the last century. I didn't think of any of this while reading the Quran 2 years previously, even though I knew full well it was written on the Arabic Peninsula in the 7th century. Sure, I found out already in November 2012 that pork is poisonous, which made me stop eating it. But as often and as clearly as the Quran says it's prohibited, it says nothing about just why. The scientific research around it is pretty much something totally different, but at the same time a real good explanation and also the actual reason for it. But then we also have a whole lot of other verses that once again couldn't have possibly been written by any human being anywhere on this whole planet 1400 years ago. As much as Islam does go hand in hand with modern science, it's also about moral guidance, not just diet-related health. But it's because of my garbage diet until 2012 that I remained so immoral until I converted. I also started a Facebook group gathering a few other practicing Muslims from Umeå who I trusted, who I knew were concerned about practicing Islam, keen on the deen, if you will, but who also had a foot in the outside world, dunya if you will, who weren't totally isolated like I experienced too many practicing Muslims to be. That way, I got answers to plenty of questions I asked related to Islam. That was way safer than Googling up the question, going through different internet sites and then drawing your own conclusions completely, which could lead to hell, literally actually. The winter of 2016. The Kush again. Shortly after New Year's, I found this Dean Show episode about cannabis and it turned me upside down like nothing else, morally that is. I hadn't been using any cannabis since May, but I still thought it was cool and had planned on going back to it right this month. But now I decided to quit it altogether. I had already had a hard time performing a few prayers and had also giggled a little at the mosque, so of course it was easy to choose the Dean over the green, and it was only right considering all other aspects of life. I strongly disagreed already then though that you should have to get a prescription for medical cannabis from a Muslim doctor. Regarding the medical stuff, you can't always expect a doctor to write a prescription for you. He'll most likely only give you something else much worse than even the illegal, unregulated street skunk. I've seen articles about white Swedes above 30, one of them a cop, who started growing weed at home after having gotten sick of all these pills, and then of course got busted. And even if there is medical cannabis available, you can't always find a Muslim doctor for that. And if you did, why would it be any less okay if a non-Muslim doctor wrote the same prescription for you? Right is right and wrong is wrong. You can never let religious titles alone determine one's credibility. Above all this, legalizing cannabis and/or other drugs has nothing to do with just letting people use drugs like nothing. It's really about making medical cannabis available and creating a white market where the drugs are regulated, taxed and have an age limit, and thus get rid of the black market where the drugs are unregulated and very often injected with something else to make them more harmful or addictive. Nobody could then use cannabis in a healthy way, without getting intoxicated. Also, there would have never been any K2/spice, since people choose it above cannabis just to pass through urine tests, which I find retarded. Well, I could have never kept my jobs and my apartment had I started using spice. I got hit hard enough by a derailed pollen allergy and heavy amounts of legal pharmacy medicine for that as a result in 2019 and 20. My father, who has access to my bank account, would have also seen me buy spice on the internet, not to forget all the financial ruin it would have brought. I've always had much better access to cannabis, and with my cash money, hardly ever more than 800 crowns in total, about 114 to 133 US dollars, I had successfully gotten away with it. I also read an article once about a refugee kid who got trafficked across I think it was the Moroccan/Spanish border by drug traffickers. That made me think about who's really getting money besides the low-level street dealers in Sweden, plus some guilty feeling about my potential contribution to that. That's a direct consequence of our current war on drugs. The war on drugs in the US is also a strong source of income for Mexican cartels. I also might add that when I first bought the skunk, I thought for myself that the cash would go to my homies, to the hood, and the case of the brown hash Muslim growers in North Africa and/or the Middle East. Since it was dark brown, it was most likely from Palestine or Lebanon. Had it been light brown, it would have most likely been from Morocco or Algeria, and had it been black, it would have been clearly from Afghanistan. There's a type of hash well known as black Afghan in Sweden. I've heard there's also blue or purple hash in India or Nepal. It's real hypocritical that the quote, support your locals thing, didn't make me start buying at Livs and or Crid Hillen. The illegal status of drugs, let alone cannabis, make them also appear to be cool and exciting, and that in combination with the black market having no age limit makes the drugs both more accessible to and more requested by minors. Legalization would also be good for drug addicts since then they would get treatment instead of or without conviction. That's a very important and relevant subject that the Dean Show guest almost seemed to ignore intentionally, which really wouldn't be appreciated. If he didn't know better then okay, I'm sorry, but then he should have taken a deeper look into the actual purpose of legalization instead of just assuming that people just want to smoke freely, which many do on the other hand. Once again I recommend the documentaries, The House I Live In, Breaking the Taboo, American Drug War The Last White Hope, and How to Make Money Selling Drugs, which only discuss the war on drugs itself and not one thing about just cannabis and its medical potential, not that I remember at least. These two Muslims do describe correctly the damaging effects of cannabis which are actually true. It might sound a little exaggerated like it was about hard drugs, but since it's illegal it can very likely be mixed with and or even injected with hard drugs. That gateway theory ain't so false after all. But that's because it's illegal and thus degraded to a street drug, robbed of its medical potential. Alcohol, as legal as that is also a good gateway to hard drugs. This thing that he or the host mentions about Muslim scholars going to Jahannam before everybody else for making just one mistake in terms of mentioning fatwas made me think of those that for example claimed music's prohibited, which I refused to believe already then. That's why I didn't trust anybody too blindly. Alex Jones, who tried a little in high school, also described cannabis in a rather negative light, and rightfully so, but he never denied the truth about the war on drugs and legalization. Why then should all Muslim scholars ignore or deny it? Sure, they might not know about the issue and they're only right for saying it's haram to sell and use since that's just the fatwas. But the truth is that it's mainly Muslim youth that's targeted by the issue in all of the West, besides the US. A Japanese YouTube user said it perfect in a comment, you don't need to smoke weed to get its benefits. In fact, you're getting less benefits from smoking. You can use the oil and use in foods, which don't make you high in the mind, nor clouds the mind ingesting. It helps your body not feel pain. You can apply the cannabis oil on top of the skin where a cancer is, along with eating it to help health. Weed is a better use for healing many things, including helping children with the oil for seizures, help ridding pain from cancers and fibromyalgia, and it has cured people. Many pills that are legal and given by doctors are more harmful and kill people, more than using this. Chemicals are more dangerous than a plant. Remember there are legal prescriptions that also make you groggy and quote, high, from them, and come with warnings not to drive or do anything that you need to be sober doing so. What is the difference? None, except one is made from chemicals from doctors, or a plant. Also there are strains that do not make you sleepy, and some that help you fall asleep, all without smoking. She also said in another comment, yes, that is true, also a lot of legal drugs given by doctors kill more people than these natural medicines. Chemicals are more dangerous than a plant. Remember there are legal prescriptions that also make you groggy and high, from them, and come with warnings not to drive or do anything that you need to be sober doing so. What is the difference? None, except one is made from chemicals from doctors, or a plant that you can ingest which helps the body and do not affect the mind. Even caffeine from coffee overdosing can cause you to get high, and causes a lot of harm as it is a neurotoxin, but that is still okay. End of quote. Starting my cannabis use has actually nothing to do with hip-hop or the hood. I've always seen it as just a simple drug, not much better than tobacco and alcohol. But then during the fall of 2012 when I started taking a closer look at drugs and their different effects, I found out about the medical potential of cannabis, which made me a little interested. That's when I also started to learn about the war on drugs. Having ended up at YMCA, the ultimate junkie spot, also played its role. Some folks were even randomly picked out for obligatory urine tests during the spring of 2013 due to rumors. I didn't have to even though I had been talking a whole lot about legalization, which wasn't odd since I at the time had nothing to hide. I started using because of white, highly educated scientists, doctors, lawyers, etc., amongst them Alex Jones. Not rappers. But then when I started, I built some kind of criminal identity, rebellion against the system and a deeper connection to the hood handed to me, which I really appreciated, and I also got a little freedom from my current Alex Jones worship. That's why I had such a hard time quitting, despite the obvious damage that started showing up. It was never close to an addiction, however. I did it only every other month. However, it would take at least 3 months to become the slightest more sober than usual. But then there's always been rappers pointing out the downsides of cannabis, so I've always had an option there. Surely better than Muslim scholars just saying all music's haram. Right before I started using cannabis, I thought about what God, who I already believed in since way back, thought about this. I already knew most Muslim scholars had made it clear that it was haram, since I'd already then heard some lectures, but I decided for better and worse that they were old-fashioned, thinking that some say music's haram also. I might add that this was exactly around the time I read the Quran. The only thing I really got from it was that you can't eat pork, animals who've died by themselves, meat with blood in it, and meat that hasn't been halal slaughtered. The prohibition of intoxicants and gambling didn't get my attention. I went by science simply, but now when I think about it, there was already a whole lot of science on its damaging effects. But I thought I wasn't gonna start smoking it every day or week like everybody else. But now I had both the Quran and personal experience as reference. I might add that during September 2016, I ordered and started using legal CBD oil. I found the page thanks to Swedish reggae artist Captain Rudd. I followed the instruction by taking 1 drop the first day starting at September 21st, 2 drops the next, 3 drops the next day, and so on, until I finally took 6 drops a day. During the first weeks I took 3 drops every morning and night, but then I spread it out to 2 drops 3 times a day. Maybe a week after the first drop, I felt a strong buzz which reminded me strongly of the old skunk. Much of the old street narcissism from 2015 came back all of the sudden after having lived in relative emptiness the last year. That made me doubt if I should continue, and I even discussed it with the Muslims. I got both yes and no on that. But as the weeks went by, I became more neutralized, more back to normal. But I never got anywhere close to paralyzed, and even more concentrated in my prayers. But both the buzz and the sobriety also had a lot to do with many other things that happened around the same period, which I won't go into too much detail until further notice. But I can say as much as that I learned to memorize the last 3 Quran chapters for the prayer, and I would go on to do more chapters. 2 guys I was familiar with also passed away, only 2 weeks apart. One took an overdose somewhere in Stockholm, and the other one got stabbed in Skellefteå in a drug deal, 2 hours north of Umeå. I'd hung with the second guy pretty much regularly for the last few years, and he was also buried at home unlike the first guy. The winter of 2016. The courthouse. In early February, I googled on spying Quran, and then I found verse 12 in chapter 49, clearly prohibiting spying. This made me think of the courthouse a little actually, but it took maybe 2 weeks before it came straight to me. Digging through other people's stuff without them knowing is not the same as actually getting to know people and take part of information with their consent. I concluded that 90% of what I'd found in the courthouse was nothing compared to what I'd seen on the outside, both outdoors and on the internet, legal and illegal, halal and haram, before and after the 5th of July, 2012 when I first found the place. A case file doesn't say much about a person neither, especially not those without a record, haha. But I'd also found very much personal stuff that perhaps shouldn't be legally accessible to the public. There's a reason why things are made accessible to the public in the courthouse, and that's because people and their loved ones should be able to read stuff. Before that, I'd seen some cases on the internet, since the winter of 2010, which is totally wrong, except for sex offenders of course, which victims' names are always censored in the files unlike other cases. I'd realized there's a lot of crap I perhaps shouldn't have found out about some folks, such as drunken brawls, DUI, threatening or assaulting a guard or officer, etc. That's also real unnecessary considering all that I actually knew about them already. But I'd also realized that some folks would have probably appreciated that I found out some stuff about them. They would have probably loved to brag about their crimes publicly on Facebook, about closed or statute-barred cases that is, but they didn't want to make fools out of themselves, become attention clowns. Some had already made themselves real clear. They looked totally like cartelling from day one. I saw it just as clearly then as now. I could strongly relate to that. I also wanted people to know stuff about me, but I didn't want to have to talk about it, not even face to face. I do get the opportunity, however, through this book, and I have also talked plenty about my old cannabis use and its actual consequences on Facebook, unlike before when I bragged about it in my music. But you ain't supposed to talk about everything, no matter how good it actually is. Not because crime is something positive, but this even goes for things truly positive, such as the Islamic obligation of alms giving, zakat. But even if people would like to brag, or even have done it, it ain't always good actually that they expose it, much less do it. I also knew that the most truly useful things about the courthouse has been the few big cases that have gotten a whole lot of medial attention and have had a huge impact on pretty much entire neighborhoods and age groups. Perhaps it's even okay Islamically to read those cases, just in case you already know pretty much everything from outside. It's also good to know that drugs like benzodiazepines, I found the word in the courthouse for the very first time, have been quite common among some folks, but perhaps I could have found out without having to know exactly who did what. It's also been real useful to find out that some folks got a record just to confirm you can graduate high school, go to college or university, have your own crib and a job despite a record. But then there's a huge difference between having been convicted in the past and getting convicted in the present. Any past records might mean nothing to your current situation, while one new conviction, no matter how small the crime, could ruin everything. Or vice versa. One conviction could ruin everything right now, but then in the future, you might be free to go, have nothing to lose. For most people, the first scenario is their reality. But for me, it's always been pretty much the opposite. Perhaps it wasn't until 2020 that the first one started applying to me. Another plus is to keep yourself updated to get it confirmed that people get to keep their education, job and/or residence despite getting convicted. Otherwise, I'd always had my old neighbor from 2011 and 12 who's done a lot and told me a lot. I find it funny now that he's always trusted me so easily with such heavy stuff. I'd always had him as proof that you can make it through anything. I'd also figured that being convicted and a criminal is far from the same thing. Anybody could get convicted now and then, while criminals can make it real far without getting caught. And how do you think I figured that out? I felt like a cheater for going behind people's backs like that, digging through their stuff instead of getting to know them better and spending more time with them physically, getting information from them with their consent, having them on Facebook and Insta, etc. Backbiting others is always wrong, and clearly haram, but that's something they have to account for, not something I had consciously chosen. I felt that much more stripped, straight up naked by this discovery in the Quran. I saw a whole lot in high school already just as it was. Criminality was also much more widespread among people my age back then than those born in 94 to 97 when they were in that age. Of course I got curious and also pretty much inevitably affected by it, much due to those girls I had beef with. They posed a huge threat, and I ain't experienced anything close to that with the young ones. But on the other hand, I would have perhaps gotten more easily into the hood just as I was had it not been for all the criminality. You only get so far just by sitting in the courthouse, or at home for that matter, reading people's cases. After all that I've told you now, I decided to leave the courthouse behind me. I'd concluded I would have been just fine without it since early 2014, especially if I'd gotten as much out of life back in those days as I did in 2015. I couldn't complain, I only felt divinely strong just for that reason. As much as I'd already gotten out of real life, I expected myself to only get more out of it as a reward. I didn't just want stuff, I wanted to earn it. No matter how good something actually was, I also wanted to get it the right way. All the way until New Year's, I would have been scared to death to leave the courthouse, and even more so gone through all these years without it completely. But now I only looked forward to a life without it. However, leaving the courthouse and staying away from it would soon turn out to be one of my life's greatest mistakes, something I can regret to this day given the lasting consequences. But it didn't all happen because of this one Quran verse. That was only a branch of the tree that I did cut off later, but the tree remained for much longer. That's the real reason I ain't fully recovered yet. The spring and summer of 2016. Nightclubs, music and Ramadan. On the Wednesday of May 5th, the day before Ascension Thursday, rapper Abadaz performed at Corona. Now that I, unlike 2015, took Islam dead serious, it became real difficult to decide if I should go or not. Normally I would have just done it without a doubt, but now from a normal, worldly perspective I made a very sick choice by skipping this event. I wrote about this decision on Facebook the next day. I had sometimes heard that going to the nightclub is officially haram. I couldn't decide if that was true, but still, the nightclub is essentially a haram swamp. Whack music, alcohol, gambling and lightly dressed women. I had since way back disliked having to pay like 100 crowns, about $10, only to get bombarded with all this crap music at a tinnitus concert volume and watch everybody else drinking, gambling and dancing for hours, totally busy and uncontactable. Now I saw clearer than ever before just how lost everybody was at the dance floor when I was at the club for the very last time in the winter of 2016. I'd always gotten much more out of just hanging out in the streets or downtown, when everybody's sober, with exception for a blunt here and there plus all the drunken whites downtown, and can talk to each other in a normal tone instead of screaming into each other's ears and yet not be heard properly, listen to music by choice on the phone, eat at some restaurant, much cheaper than the club, even the entry alone, etc. Not even then could I regret 90% of all my club visits during those 7 years, but that's probably because I'd always chosen my club visits wisely and also had hardly ever had a drink, and in those cases very little. I went to the club pretty much every single weekend during 11th grade, especially Krugen from early September 2009 to early March 2010. It was dope considering the people there. I also went quite often to Corona and 5 during 2011, mainly because I knew so many people there those times. Since then it's been mainly about rap acts performing, almost all Swedish acts. But now lately, I'd become much more critical towards the club life. It also didn't go too good the last 2 times I went to Corona during early 2016. But that was far from the first time I had a bad club night. I remember one time during April 2014, when I had a bad night at local. I wrote on Facebook something like, "I'm more fit for church than the club." But my research into Islam made me ponder on whether I should do this or not, and I eventually decided to not go. I still couldn't decide whether going to nightclubs was officially haram or not, but one good reason not to go was the music. Not music by default, but in particular the music that gets played at the club, guaranteed at least 90%. It's easy to refrain from alcohol, gambling and dancing. Not because I ever found out if dancing is haram by default, but maybe considering the music and all the lightly dressed and or intoxicated women, who were mostly 18-19 and thus were much younger than me already these days. But considering the music, you ain't got a choice but to either put up with it, or abstain from being at the club altogether. I felt it in the spring of 2010 already. I'd been at 5 a few times and started getting tired of it, mostly just because there were hardly any minorities there. I had also studied the Illuminati mad hard and how they were behind all the crap music that got played. I started roaming the downtown streets instead and soon later the hood, which gave me much better results. I also gave up 5 in the middle of the summer in 2011 even though there were always people there, and that was because I was depressed and just wanted to roam the streets and be alone. It was something quite different but yet a better alternative, but not the very best though. Crap music could appear anywhere though. For example, how often don't radio stations play at grocery stores, and that ain't always the best music. I remember eating lunch one time at a restaurant in Haag Satra during the Muslim Family Days, an event in Stockholm during the Easter weekend, quite close to where MFD was held. They played One Direction videos on a TV screen there. Now it's obvious you don't bear any personal responsibility for what music gets played wherever you are, and you ain't there just to listen to the music. You can't say it's haram to walk into a store or a restaurant just because of the music that might get played there. But considering the nightclubs, I personally felt even more that you have by default chosen to put up with the music there, as awful as it is lyrically and as loud as it is. I had gotten so much out of life thanks to Islam all my life actually, and I had also sacrificed so much in life without even being a Muslim. I was no longer afraid of leaving the clubs for good. Due to age, I had also become less lonely these days about abstaining from even the most hyped up nights, and Abaddaz was one hyped up rapper at the time, and there had always been plenty of stuff happening on the outside even then which I could have experienced instead. I would though immediately miss a lot about the club life. All the Swedish rap acts, all the people there and all the action, mainly fights actually, haha, which I also didn't have to read in court, but I wouldn't however miss the music that I otherwise never heard, nor the alcohol that makes it much harder to actually interact with people, but which is also behind most fights. And once again, there had always been options, even more so these days. It was over now on my behalf at least, officially. One time during April or May, I removed all the music I had uploaded. Then in June, Ramadan actually, I uploaded a few songs, more or less remade. The greatest loss of all that came along with deep diving into Islam was definitely my prosperous rap career, which I had to remove altogether. But I still hoped for a distant but yet possible rap career with more pro-Islamic messages, with Allah's pleasure and permission. Then in March 2018 I managed to upgrade my SoundCloud a little more. I also went through Ramadan more correctly this time than the last year. Besides the prayers, I also fasted correctly. The previous summer, I swallowed a little water now and then after having caught some liquid in the throat, worrying it would cause throat burn, a mad old habit. But now I refrained altogether. I also went to the mosque in Oldham much more often and prayed with others, especially during the last 10 days. There were plenty of extra prayers, tarawih, and I also got to break the fast, iftar, together with others at the mosque much more often than the previous summer. A huge plus about my first Ramadan was that I no longer needed to wash my face and drink water every time I entered a building just to avoid a headache, a mad old habit also. I wrote about it on Facebook and then another Muslim brother told me he got rid of his pollen allergy thanks to Ramadan. Well, this spring and summer, I didn't need to take one single allergy pill. Only eye drops now and then, and even that much less than previously. The pills were certainly over the counter, but still they had a small but significant effect on me. This year I didn't need to become pill numb, but only the next year would the pollen allergy return. The rest is a bunch of completely different chapters, and it ain't been nothing nice. Epilogue. During April 2021, I wanted to go through these chapters as they were written in the winter of 2017 and update them as minimally as necessary, due to my fatigue syndrome which had made me extremely paralyzed over the past year. The book turned out to be significantly more updated than expected. Then in December 2022, I got to go through all this again while recording it for YouTube. As you've probably noticed, this last chapter is very lacking and should have a whole lot more content than it does. Nor should it be the last chapter. Anyway, I have as of now denounced most of my Islamic beliefs. This book is so far more about what led me to Islam as opposed to what happened after I converted. Now a whole lot remains, but that gets to be told at a completely different time simply. Thank you for listening.